We're here to talk about implementing Agile architecture. I've got Anthony Murphy here with me, who is with a major bank. We can't we can't use the exact name because major bank will have to do for now. And do you want to kick into the next slide?
Yeah. If it wants to do it, there we go.
All right. So, hi, I'm Scott. I'm the founder and CEO of Terem. We're a product development firm. We were on the AFR Fast 100 2 years running, based solely on delivering product outcomes for our clients. I've personally been involved in over 61 major product launches, everywhere from the engineering side to the product side to the commercial side to the sales side. You name it. This is what I live for. Do like making sausages, sailing boats, and in lockdown times, I've not been wearing a tie. That is true, but I also have gotten into roasting coffee. So if you've got coffee roasting tips, please send them my way. Now, Anthony, who Ant and I met through a really cool community called the Product Coalition. Hat tip to the Product Coalition and Jay, check it out if you can, productcoalition.com. We met through that community and we got talking about Agile and architecture and implementing it at scale at places like banks, large tech companies, you name it. And we thought, hey, and said, oh, I've got a talk that I've done on this, and also I've got some recent experience that I want to update the talk with. And so, look, I love this topic, so I was really keen to hear it, and I thought, what better way to do it than to share it with everyone as well. I think one thing I learned about Ant in this process is for his school, he wrote a game, which maybe brings his love of Mario there. But wrote a game for his final school project. So I think gaming's a bit of a thing for Ant. And over to you, mate. I'm going to let you kick into your talk.
Yeah, and I just have I can't actually see myself on my screen now that I'm sharing the screen, so it's a little bit disorientated. I feel like I'm talking to my wall. I can't even see you, which is, so bear with me. I guess, I'm not sure if I have a love for games actually, but I have a love for this theme. Maybe it's the aesthetics of it or something. Okay. But as you can tell by this slide, I didn't put this together just for today, just to show you up and have a better intro slide. It's actually a talk I've done before, and you're going to probably see plenty of this kind of 80s arcade in the next, an hour almost, right? But agree, this
serious stuff we're talking about. We're not playing it. It's serious stuff. It's just a cool way of it.
Maybe that's a reason why I kind of gravitated towards this theme. I think I gravitated towards it for two reasons. Like one of them being, in organizations, I guess, I'll talk a bit about it, is it's like a bit of like going back in time when it comes to architecture. But I think maybe I wanted to bring some humor to a theme that can be quite serious and maybe a little depressing for some, depending on what situation you're in. Well, anyways, I'll get stuck into it. So we're talking about Agile architecture. I guess a bit of background on me. This is kind of what I do now, is kind of help organizations kind of become more product led. Part of that of the puzzle is Agile, and I kind of like blend my product management and Agile background together, and in this weird concoction to kind of do what I'm doing today. So I used this as a title, and I actually wrote this as a blog, and that's how I ended up doing the talk. And I kind of said the rise of messy, inconsistent, and emergent architecture, and got some varied responses. But I guess often with particular executives, I guess messy kind of scares them and inconsistent. But I'll talk a bit through it as to why it's important and why things should be messy and inconsistent, and why it's not so much a bad thing. As a disclaimer at the beginning of this is, one, I have no association with Nintendo, even though you'll see like a lot of their kind of theme and slides in this picture. I think we just talked through some of the reasons why I might have picked that. I don't know, maybe something working in the subconscious there. But on a more serious note, I guess a disclaimer from my end is that, I said I come from more of a product management Agile background. I'm, I was an engineer at one stage. I did write a Space Invaders game as part of like one of my assessments for programming. I did do engineering for 2 years. Last time I cut code was probably like 3-4 years ago, 4 years probably now, maybe even 5 now that I think about it. But what I'm getting at is I'm not like an expert in architecture. I don't have 20 years of like systems architecture background behind me. But a lot of things I'm going to talk through is, ways of framing architecture and ways of doing things. And I pretty much learned them by being on the ground in the trenches, doing this with people who are experts in their field, really partnering with them and trying to reshape the organization's architecture in that way. So where do we start?
I think you're being a bit humble there, Ant. Personally,
yeah,
having seen you talk, I think you're being a bit humble, but I'll let you keep going.
We'll let my humbleness continue, I guess. Thanks for that, though. I guess, yeah. So, blast from the past is kind of where I start, and this is maybe where the '80s arcade theme kind of come from, and that is because when particularly as a consultant, and I know you resonate with this, Scott. In the line of work you do as well, is that you go into organizations and it's like the rise of monoliths. There's these monolithical applications everywhere and they do weird and wonderful things. They almost do like everything under the sun. And there was good reason for that. When we maybe architecture looks like this, and when we did architecture, we came from the point of view of how do we maximize reuse, code reuse and stuff? How do we maximize consistency? So we don't have things living in different areas becoming inconsistent. And particularly any executive's favorite, they're coming from the angle of how do I reduce costs? Particularly when you think about IT or technology, even as, some organizations still today, but even as early as like 10, 20 years ago, people still viewed technology as a cost center and not as a enabler or a core function of their business. So yeah, cost center kind of leads to reducing costs, I guess. And what happens when we do this, when we kind of, want to be more agile, we want to create these concepts of end-to-end product teams. Often we kind of put it over the top of our existing architecture and we say, great, go for it. You're this end-to-end team. We say all the buzzwords, right? Like you're empowered, you're autonomous, you're, yeah, you guys can do it. But in reality, what ends up happening if your architecture is still the same is if that team wants to do something, they need to change, let's say, this component. In actual fact, that means they're going to impact, multiple teams or multiple products, which is not great because then we have this knock-on effect to, multiple customers and impacting them. And sometimes it's worse. I've seen places where they've taken the whole like website down or like the whole everything down, the whole business down, and that's not great.
And just the approval process to make a change to someone's component is like life destroying. Can I change one line of code? Well, I don't know.
Well, actually, I'm just going to go back because talking about this scenario, I've had experiences where we've had that conversation like, to that point, can we just change this? Can you just do that? And everyone just kind of freaks out and they go, you know what, this application, whatever it is, it just had its 21st birthday or its 18th birthday, and everyone is just shit scared of changing anything on it because nobody understands how it actually works, and it just kind of, it does, and it holds everything together, and everyone just doesn't want to touch it. And yeah, it's not a great place to be in, I guess. So what I also see is often organizations then say, well, this isn't working, right? Like teams are all kind of interdependent. It's a nightmare, like, or at least they're breaking each other's stuff. They're stepping on each other's toes. And the other thing that they don't like is things are becoming inconsistent. Hey, you did something on my component, and we end up in that world too. Like nobody touch it, only we know how to use the code. So often organizations start to go down this concept of component teams to try and resolve that. And what ends up happening, as we know, is that then we need 4 teams to just do that, feature that we wanted to do or deliver that thing to that customer. And that's not great because we need to align everybody. But in reality, what I find is it's not like we have 4 teams trying to do one feature. It's actually multiple features happening concurrently. And that means that it starts to look a bit more like this, like team D, like team A is waiting on team D to do something. Team D is trying to do something for team B for feature B, I guess. Team B, however, is busy working on feature C because team J is jumping up and down asking for it. So team J is working with team F to try and do something. So team F is, dependent on team G to do that feature A, and they're just like, well, I'm trying to do something with J. Sorry, you're going to have to wait. But then team I is kind of
bugging a mess, doesn't it?
Be like, yeah, exactly, to try and do this thing, and then team F's trying to do this, and it all culminates in. And this slide is great. Like, I've showed this a few times, and people are like, that is exactly how I feel right now, like running around dodging.
Avoid the fire.
Yeah, you can almost think of the fire as like, I don't know, requests from other teams, and you're like trying to dodge them and trying to just, I don't know, do what you need to do. And yeah, it's just this nightmare. And sometimes it's hard to resolve too. So like, often you have maybe agile experts, or you read the stuff and they say like, let's do this, let's do big room planning, or let's create these dependency boards. And this is a classic. So you can imagine that previous picture of the fires going everywhere, and that you basically create a board that visualizes that. And it's just, if anyone's done it before, they know what I'm talking about. It's just miles and miles of string just everywhere, and people tend to hate it, and it's messy, and they just go, and yeah, particularly stakeholders hate it. But it shows the problem, I guess, is I guess the point. Doesn't fix the problem, but it shows the problem. We talk about Scrum or Scrums, or like increased coordination. We add more process change management is a classic one that, Scott, you mentioned just a second ago about, jumping through loops to get things actually changed or change somebody's code. Increased coordination, it's probably another one that we just kind of talk about, or maybe we say, you know what, we need to create these leads that, feature leads, or like owners who kind of herd all the cats and make sure all the teams are doing it. And all in all, this kind of adds up into a game of Tetris, and you end up game over. And I've seen this as well, and I've been there with an organization, and they actually say, you know what, Agile doesn't work. Agile does, and I've actually probably been there more than once. And I don't know how many times you've been there, Scott. I'm probably sure you've seen it as well, right? Like, they just go, you know what, it doesn't work. It's messy. Things are inconsistent. Teams are stepping on top of each other's. When we try and resolve it, it's all interdependent. Yeah.
I have seen it, and often it's like a bit of a gray area where no one says anything, and it just kind of reverts back to waterfall, or reverts to something that's doesn't even have a label. It's just now in gray zone, where Agile was rejected informally or formally, and waterfall's rejected, and now everyone just does stuff.
Yeah, totally. And that's I definitely said that as well. It's like this, like rolling back to a previous working version. It's like deploying something in production, being like, oh crap, it doesn't work. Go back, abort. And yeah, whether they go back to waterfall or just some weird gray area, yeah, I've definitely seen that before. But I almost empathize with them in this situation, because I'm like, well, you're not wrong, because when everybody's so interconnected and dependent on each other's, and we're breaking things and stepping on each other's toes, well, it's not working. I agree with that. And sure, maybe in that situation, you would be better off going to a previous world order and having, people who plan these things and manage these things. And yeah, but I guess what this whole kind of thing's about is to kind of approach it from a different way, right? Were you going to say something, Scott? Yeah,
I was just going to say one of the things that comes with that uninstallation, and is all that chaos is like, well, actually that promise of speed, of agility never came, and that was what was promised, and it didn't come because there was too much chaos, and actually the planning was kind of needed, or so I think that speed doesn't eventuate. So you're kind of right to say it didn't work.
Yeah, for sure. And how can you be autonomous or adaptable when you're when you're so interconnected? Like, it's just not going to happen. And I'm probably going to talk a bit more about that too. and I agree. Yeah, there's an element of, Agile didn't really give me the answers I was hoping it would. And this is probably something, and this is the reason why I was inspired to write the blog. And I'm very fortunate and happy to like talk about this again today, is because I actually think this topic doesn't get enough light. Like, we talk about those things in that Tetris that I had up before. We talk about big room planning. We talk about dependency boards. We talk about, autonomous end-to-end teams. But how many times has like an Agile coach been like, or maybe I'm picking on Agile coaches, but, or anybody in an Agile transformation actually kind of sit down and say, well, let's revisit our architecture. I don't see that happen anywhere near enough, in my view.
Yeah,
Yeah, and as I kind of highlighted there, it's very interconnected. I don't think org design, team structure, and architecture are mutually exclusive. They're intertwined, and one's going to dictate the other if you don't be deliberate about it, right? And this is kind of where I'm coming from. So different mindset. And just kind of what I'm saying is agility needs the right foundation, and your foundation starts in your code base, and then it's supported by your team structure, and then it's supported by your ways of working, which is then supported by your culture, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, we then get the benefit that we want. So let's talk about how we go about this. Before we do, this is kind of the question that I tend to pose to executives when we kind of get into this conundrum. Potentially even before I go into like talking about let's restructure org and stuff, is to ask them, well, what do they value? Do they want 100% maximum consistency of code and design and look and feel and maximum reuse, and do they care about lowering infrastructure costs and those types of things? Or do they care about speed to market, being adaptable, having autonomous teams, and that type of stuff? Because ultimately, and this is why I frame it this way, because sometimes it helps them kind of think about it, is that these two are not entirely competing goals, but the more and more you go down the low cost consistency path, the less and less autonomy you're going to have, and the slower you're going to travel for many reasons. So you kind of got to prioritize them. And if your priorities aren't in the right, I shouldn't say the right order, because I don't think there's a right or wrong, but if your priorities are that low infrastructure cost, etc., then what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides is probably not for you. And I'm usually happy to finish the conversation there and be like, well, let's go down a different path of what it may look like. But if you are saying, no, bring it on, I want autonomy, I understand that things are going to diverge and be inconsistent and cost is going to go up a bit, but I'm going to get the benefits of adaptability and speed and market, then great. Then let's explore what that looks like. Yeah.
Cool. And now I just have one problem with this slide. Is that Mario is the one who, wouldn't it be Peach or Bowser? But anyway, that's okay.
True. But I wanted to do this where Mario jumped down because like we're making a choice, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So
cool.
Yeah.
I'll let you keep going.
No, good. So where do we start? So we start with measuring time to value, which is like how long that feature or whatever it maybe takes to get to the customer, which I guess this is correct, right? Like Mario trying to make it to Peach. And we start there. So you want to measure it. Like a lot of places are measuring it, but the idea is that, I think it was Denim that said it, that if you don't measure it, you can't improve it, right? So the idea is we need to measure it so we know what we're dealing with, and then we can start to kind of bring that time to value down. And the first step we kind of do, and I wrote tip because, I'll just talk a little bit about why I wrote tip instead of step one. I originally had step one, and I was like, no, it's not step one, because I want this to be more like a framework, more like a playbook, as opposed to like a step-by-step guide. That's number one. Number two, I also recognize that everyone's organization and architecture is in a different state. So, it may not make sense to start here. You might start somewhere else. So, so I think, tip's the reason why I said tip.
If you were trying not to offend people and we're going to be very direct about it, would you change the word tip to step one?
So if you are in that interdependent, monolithic architecture world, then yes, I'll say this is step one.
Break them up. Yeah.
recognizing that people are in a spectrum and there's flux and yada, yada, yada. Yeah. Yeah. So how do you break up your monoliths is the first question. Like, what do we do it by? You know, I don't know, somewhat biased being a product person, but I think organizing around your products makes sense. The reason why you do that is because this man, Melvin Conway, actually wrote this thesis back in 1967. And it's amazing how much it still like stands true today, because the systems that we have today are so, you know, different to 1967. Your computers don't take up a whole room anymore. But he said that any organization which designs a system will be constrained to produce basically a copy of their organizational structure or the communication structure. And what he's getting by that, Melvin Conway's getting by, it's commonly known as Conway's law, is that if you have this, like, you know, perfect example is like front end, back end team construct. If they're separated as separate teams, then your application or your product that you produce is going to feel disconnected in that way as well. It's going to mirror your, you know, your structure. And you often see that when like front end has trouble talking to back end inside, like you're trying to do something, I don't know, log in or something, and like the whole API pipe in for that is a mess, and that ends up kind of coming up in the front end, and it, you know, makes experiences feel disjointed. I see this a lot as well in, you know, when you think about an experience, kind of a customer journey, cross-cut in multiple teams, you tend to find that there's logical handovers that you can almost observe just by being a customer. You're like, oh, so you guys don't talk to each other, and that's why I get this experience over here when I use that part of your product, and then when I use this part, you know, it's different. A good example could be, you know, this is probably something that resonates with everyone. Using AWS is very different to using Amazon as, like, you know, buying the products off, right? They're very, very separated. And for good reason, but yeah, you can think about if within that, you know, Amazon website that was disjointed, then yeah, that would be not ideal. So that's why we kind of start with products, because, you know, I kind of turn it into more plain English here, and I just say, like, you want to structure your teams around your products because that's what you're doing. You want to be customer centric. And your products solve customer problems, right? And then you want to structure your teams around that. And therefore you want to structure your architecture around your teams and not the other way around. Or otherwise you're kind of doing business with yourself and you're not doing business with your customers in English way. So your architecture starts to look a bit like this. And this is, you know, I did this with an organization, and I was saying it to Scott. It was probably like 2-3 years ago now. Actually, yeah, 3 years ago now. And this is what we did. We just broke it all up to the nth degree. We first of all, we did a big audit of what we consider our product is and how the team's construct should look. And then we just broke up the architecture. So every single team had their own tech stack, and they're completely autonomous. And the benefit that it gives is that, you know, obviously they're not dependent anymore, but it comes with a cost. And that cost is that we duplicated things. So you can think about like a login screen, for example. Every team would do login in a different way. Might even use different tools for you know, login. So centralized, which makes, like, you know, single sign-on and all that type of stuff a bit of a nightmare at this stage. But this is by no means like the end state. This is like step one of many steps. And the other thing that it kind of comes with is a cost. Naturally, duplicating everything meant that we had, you know, more, you know, AWS containers running. That increases costs, more code bases, et cetera, et cetera. But teams love it because they can do something. They only deliver it to their customers, their product, and everybody else stays happy. But again, step one, right? I wanted to touch on this in particular because I thought it was fascinating, and, you know, Scott talked about some of my recent experience that I've now had that I can kind of add flavor to on this, which is around not going, you know, microservices overload. And this is often the criticism that people have of microservices. They're like, you know, it's, you know, we end up with thousands of microservices. Nobody understands what it does and stuff. And yeah, there's like this trade-off, this kind of balance between them. And, you know, there's one end of the spectrum where you're, you know, completely, your massive monolithical architecture, and the other end of the spectrum, which is, you know, thousands of microservices. And this architecture talk, this, you know, this basically article talks about the cost of that and how it basically incurs a, you know, if you have too many, and the experience that I had was there was a team that had like basically 10 people and they had 30 microservices to look after, which is like too much for one team. So you struggle with being able to maintain it, understand what all the code bases do. So there's this happy medium. And what I did with the team is we basically kind of grouped a bunch of microservices together, and we basically created another team as well and offloaded it. And basically in the end, we ended up with about 10 to 12 microservices per team of a team of about 10 people. So they could, you know, more easily understand all the code bases and be across it. So I only raise it because I'm like, just be conscious of not going too far down the other end and breaking things up to the nth degree. And because you'll create another problem for yourself. And you can read that article, we can send it out.
And as well as the cognitive load, one of the ones for me is, you know, you're putting load on the team, you're adding cost by adding microservices, but the other one is just, yeah, the performance issue that you can come across. Sometimes if you're going for performance, and it was the same with object-oriented programming, you can end up with too many objects, too many services, where really you just got to get your performance better. And that means sometimes a monolith, really, to get what you need to get done in the time frame. And there's other use cases as well. It's just that's one I throw in because I've definitely come up against that one a couple of times as well. But I'll let you keep going.
Yeah, no, yeah, definitely. I like the speed thing, and the cost is a big thing, but I just found it very fascinating to talk about just the mental load and being able to just
it's huge.
And this is why I kind of turned it into tips and not like steps, because I understand, you know, I've talked about this with organizations, and some organizations are at that stage where, you know, I had a conversation with a head of engineering, they're like, oh, we have like 200 and something microservices here. It's like, I have no clue of what any of them do. And like, yeah, it's creates another problem.
And so also just want to make sure that we, just with time, that we get through. Yeah, cool.
No, it's all good. We're kind of through the next bit. So the next thing is to you've broken everything down, you've kind of duplicated everything. Now we start to centralize things, and we start to find logical groupings and allowing things to kind of have those reuse, those consistency kind of benefits. And one of the ways we do that is versioning. Versioning is great. Many organizations do versioning, but I find they're only getting like a piece of one of the benefits of versioning, not all the benefits. And what I mean by that is I often ask, how many versions do you have running in production? They're like, one. There's only one version. I'm like, well, you know, you could theoretically have this. And I've done this before as well. And this is one of the things that helps is, let's say you have a shared library. So we duplicated everything. Everything's all V1. We then create a shared library. And then we allow people to update that library and create new versions. People update to a new version themselves. We create, you know, more changes, new version. And what you end up here is, like in this example, there's 3 versions running in production of the same, you know, thing or component. And the reason why you want to do that is because I don't want to, if you go back to that, you know, previous where you only have one version running in production, well, cool, we've got the shared component, shared library, but as soon as we make any changes to it, everybody has to adopt the changes. And then that's when we end up back in that monolithical interdependency world. We end up in these big testing cycles where I make a change and then I need to go tell all the other teams that they made a change. They then need to like do regression testing. And then like, yeah, it's not providing speed or autonomy is what's happening. So what we do is we allow people to create new versions, and we kind of have multiple versions running, and we support multiple versions. One of the lessons that we learned doing this was that you need to be very clear and provide guidelines around what that looks like. What I mean by that is we did 2 ways. There's 2 ways you can do this. Probably more, but 2 ways I've done it. One is time-based. So we say any version is going to exist for 3 months, and then you're going to have to update to the new version. We do that that made a lot of sense in places where they changed all the time, frequently, right? So we just put a time frame on it, and it's just kind of like a roll in 3 months, and everybody kind of updates in their own time within that 3 months, and then updates again. And yeah, so once it hits 3 months, whatever version you're on, if it's 3 months old, it kind of gets orphaned, and then you got to move on to the new one. And you need to do that as a team, right? So you need to keep an eye on these things, and the onus comes onto you. And if you don't do it, then essentially your product's going to break. And so it's up to you. So you've got an incentive to do it as well. But we're not telling you to do it now. We're telling you to work out between your priorities in the next 3 months to work out when it makes sense for you to do that.
Just like using an open source library or some package software or something. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other way to do it is to have X versions running in production. So they worked really well on things that didn't change that frequently. So we'll say like you will have 3 versions or 5 versions running in production at once, which means that if you're on the 5th version and somebody's creating a 6th one, you better update before they release that. And yeah, it's kind of up to you to not be on that kind of last one in the spectrum. And to kind of Scott's point, this is a pattern you see in the open source world, and we kind of, we took it from there and we started to apply even more stuff from the open source world. So we're like, well, could we get that library or that component and treat it like open source code? And that's kind of exactly what we did. And it worked really well, not just in libraries, but also on like shared components or even like platforms. And you can imagine, like, how shared kind of open source works. There's something shared. People can branch off it, kind of make their own changes, add to it. Somebody's got to make a change and think it's really, awesome and everybody should benefit from it. So then they do like a pull request. There's some kind of gatekeeper that looks at that, says, yeah, that looks good, brings it into the code base for everyone to kind of enjoy. And typically that would then create a new version. And these are some of the things that that we found you need to create it and make it successful. And you see it from the open source world, but there's so many patterns you can kind of apply from that and bring it within your organization that works. And like letting teams just branch on it and create like their own kind of bespoke stuff on top of it worked really well, because then they didn't have to wait for whoever owned or maintained that platform or component. So I did this done it in 2 constructs, one where it's kind of shared and then the gatekeeper just exists in some other team and it's on top of their day job and they kind of just review it. But we also do it where that's a platform and a platform team owns and manages it. And what it enables is if somebody goes, hey, platform team, I need ABC because we want to do this. Often what happens is they say, no, sorry, not a priority for us right now. We'll put it on the roadmap or whatever. And then the other teams need to reshuffle their priorities. But the reality is for that team, the reason why they're asking for that is because it's a priority for them like now. They want it now because that's their problem. That's the outcome that they're trying to chase. So by enabling teams to just branch and make changes themselves, it meant that, okay, thanks platform team. I know you're busy. We'll do it ourselves. And that's exactly what they did. So they'll branch it, they'll make changes. And then, if they thought that the change was good enough, then they'll request to get it back into the code base. But in order to, go.
And what if it's a service? So what if I've got a service rather than a code component where I can't, if I start branching it, am I duplicating the service? So, so there's a CMS running and I need to make a change to something in the CMS or the content management system. Can I just duplicate the content management system? How do I do that if it's a service that's a shared component?
Yeah, so I've done it both ways. So we've duplicated, create a new service with your new changes, and then we can basically work out whether we move people across into that new service or not at some stage. Typically that works really well when there's like, I see this a lot too, when people do like lifts and shifts of full applications, and then it makes sense to duplicate things and then people will progressively shift across as they get rid of the legacy and they move to the new platform. However, if it's something that's not legacy, not lift and shift and stuff, then that kind of previous world where it's just versioning, that can work really well too. It can be like, well, you guys just create a new version, call it 2.0 or whatever. And we will keep maintaining this version. So they'll obviously make updates. There's an element of when you want to move people to that version of cutting things across, but sometimes you might not want to, like it might just make sense that it exists just for that product because nobody else is going to benefit from those changes, which is kind of something that I'll get to in a second as well. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So like versioning is a big part. Contribution guide, obviously, because you need kind of consistency and stuff in that.
Well, look, it doesn't, it does it, because sometimes, like I gave the example of a content management system, you know, there might be
Yes.
involved where you're paying per processor or something on the licensing, where it becomes challenging and actually the team's going to have to update. I guess you still arrive at some dependencies, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I'd say like, okay, so like a CMS is a good example of something where we still have like this kind of almost monolithical platform, right? And that, I mean, if it makes sense for your situation, your organization, then sure, it makes sense. And if you are paying per thing, either you're comfortable with incurring the cost of having, you know, multiple services that all do, you know, a nuance on top of what the other
Yeah.
service does, or we control it all and we manage those costs, and we go back to, you know, that choice that I had with Mario, kind of, right? So you're making that choice. You're saying, well, or do we keep it all in this one service and we have one person maintain it, which means we have a hard dependency and we're not allowing teams any freedom to get around that. Or we're saying, yes, we're going to incur that cost and that duplication, and we're okay to let teams do it because they'll be able to move faster.
Yep.
It's going to be a case by case. I think in that CMS one, yeah, and to your point, that could make more sense to not do. Not treat it like open source, have a team that manages it, and yeah, it has to go through that team. But it's kind of up to the organization to decide, I guess. Yeah.
And
But
nature component as well, right? Like,
yeah,
involved with a component, and yeah, I'll let you keep going.
yeah, definitely. And there's an element of freedom within boundaries, and you're drawing the lines of where that boundary is. Like the boundary ends here, and in another organization, the boundary might not end there for whatever reason. This is kind of like the last one, which was kind of probably the coolest. And this was something that was a totally unexpected benefit that we got out of it, which was thinking in terms of layers of your architecture. And it was a happy accident, but I use it now a lot and it's really good. So you can imagine you've got one end of the spectrum where you've got full custom components, you know, duplicated, you know, teams. Even that service example, you've got 5 different services that all do 80% the same thing, but they're all, you know, custom. And then you got the other end which we're just talking about, where we just bring it all together and we have one service that everybody uses. And then you got like this middle ground where maybe not in the service sense, but in like a component sense or a library sense, you can kind of have, you know, branches off it with, you know, nuance is built on top, which, you know, open source and versioning kind of facilitates. And what we found in this kind of with these layers was it really allowed the architecture to evolve. And when I say evolve, I mean like evolve in like Darwinism sense. I mean, like it enabled the architecture to evolve organically and not have, you know, people saying this is what it should look like or this, and, you know, and really manage it, or have somebody who owns architecture, enterprise architecture. It was very much distributed, organic, and, you know, self-organizing.
And look, this,
what I meant,
Anthony, I was
yeah,
going to say, this is one of the interesting things I've found with the. I think it's sometimes a hard shift mentally for some people to make, especially say some enterprise architects or solution architects, and security folks and all that, to suddenly, whereas their role previously was to have the answers and the structure, the role shifts in an agile architecture to be the coach and to be providing the guidelines and the thinking to make sure people are thinking about it in the right way, and the guardrails, but not to be actually making the decisions. They're empowering the teams to make the decisions. And what I've often observed is when these things are being put into practice is that, and it can even vary within an organization that's doing this, depending on the mindset of the architect or security person or there's a whole bunch of different stakeholders, but it can often depend on them and their mindset. And you can even get different results of success with this, because some don't want the teams to be autonomous and make decisions, and you're getting bottlenecks. Whereas others are like, you know, I trust you guys are going to pick the right. I've given you the information. I've given you the guidelines of what I want you to think about. I trust you're going to make the right decisions. And I'm okay with a bit of that because it's not it's not chaos, it's autonomy. And I think
Yep.
that to me is what really trips up the evolve thing. It's the kind of the secret bit where you don't end up back at step one again.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, there's an element of fear that they're losing control in their jobs. And I agree, like, that's usually one of the first questions I get when I do this, especially if there's an architect in the audience. And yeah, they're like, well, where does my job go? And it's not like your job becomes redundant, it changes, and you're spot on there. Like, they help provide those frameworks, those guidelines, and coach the teams and tech leads to become better system architects and stuff. And in some organizations, you might draw those lines where they still have a role to play, where they might still need to work out what is enterprise architect systems and what is the freedom within boundaries that the teams can kind of go crazy and autonomous within. So yeah.
So there's a question that we've got from Abby. I hope I've pronounced that right. Where the question is around. It's kind of on this topic, seeing as we're talking about, which is who's responsible for agile architecture? Is it autonomous teams or the enterprise architect?
Yeah, so great question. So typically when like I start this with the organizations that I've done this with, this is started from the top because it almost takes like the top to buy into it because they got the wallet as well, and we're talking about increasing costs. So typically it's like a CTO type role or CPO type role that's buying into it and kind of driving it, and then we have like the heads of architect and engineering and stuff that kind of go into it. But then at the end of the day, who's responsible for it overall? I guess there's an element of leadership is responsible. So there's an element of whoever's in like a head of engineering or potentially architecture or something role. They're responsible for it, but they're responsible for it not descending into chaos. And they're also responsible for it not descending into that monolithical interdependency world. The tools that they use in order to achieve that is some of the things I talked about, and making sure the teams understand this. And if you think about this like evolutional thing, making sure that everyone's clear on the layers. So people are clear on, and it kind of ties into this slide, so it's kind of nice. People are clear on what is duplicated, what are they allowed to be messy, rapid on, and this is like, you can think of it like prototyping, right? So what is the spaces where teams are allowed to just beg for forgiveness and not ask for permission, right? So an example that we had here was in an organization I helped, and we did this, was the team needed search functionality. One of them had this cool tool that search one, and they were like, let's try it, and they didn't ask for permission, they just did it, and they started using it, and they kind of signed off on the cost and stuff. And I think they got a trial initially, and then they kind of got the cost. And they started doing it. Then they started demoing it to like the rest of the organization, and a few other teams were like, hey, we could use that search functionality too. So then that's when it kind of like started to graduate into this middle tier where it's like we still somewhat duplicated because we had like 3 teams using it. And then we had like this 4th team that came along and looked into the product, and they noticed that it had a lot of like basically turning transcripts. So basically videos and audio, they could transcript it and then index those transcripts. So you could basically search on video and audio, which is like insane. So they started toying with that. So when they toyed with that, you can imagine that's still in that rapid, messy thing. And then the rest of search is in that second layer. And then eventually what ended up happening was basically the head of product and the chief product officer, we kind of got wind of it, and I was working with them as well with the architecture and a bunch of other things. And then we created a platform team for them. We created a search platform team that owned, maintained this massive search thing and indexed everything, and teams could branch off it. And we treated it like, open source, and yeah, we kind of got those benefits. So you can see how things kind of graduated, and like there's a cost and speed associated, but over time it kind of like went down these tiers.
And what's interesting there, just in the topic of responsibility, is the shift over time. So and your point at the beginning resonates with me, which is it's got to start with, there's got to be a executive manager leader who really owns the organization structure and the architectural structure as well, because you've got to change both. And then what this really shows as well is the change in responsibility that goes on. So starts out responsibility of a team because they had, they're well, I mean, arguably the enterprise architect or something beforehand is kind of, or the architect has said, you know, you can play in this box. Here's what you can
Yep.
do. They've gone in, played in the box. Something there's gone, oh, this is good. And then you can see how it kind of evolves to the point where it does become more, probably there's an architect responsible for it because it's now a shared service. There's probably other people responsible for it. It might even, you know, have some kind of management responsibility in a more direct sense because it might be such an important thing. I don't know. I'm just kind of going
Yeah,
through
no,
the responsibility change. Yeah.
yeah, you're spot on. Like it started out as, yeah, naturally, you know, a leadership set guidelines around, you know, freedom within boundaries and where they can play. So that started there. The team knew that they could just go and play with it. At some stage, that free trial ended and it had to go to somebody's wallet. So that's where responsibility shifted a little bit. And then naturally through the demos and stuff, the other team started catching wind of it. But at the same time, when it kind of moved to that second layer was when basically the chief product officer and stuff started to get wind of it. But they were still cool with it just existing there, and they just kind of let the teams kind of play with it, and we just kind of monitored it. And then when, you know, when that other team came in and started using all that transcript indexing functionality, that's when we were like started sitting down with like, you know, heads of engineering and stuff and started to say, well, what makes sense now? Where do we take this thing? And then we decided, well, it makes sense. Let's invest into it because, you know, search is so fundamental to what they did. It touches almost every product. So we created a platform team and it made sense. And then, you know, responsibility kind of shifted again. But it's cool to like let it, and we were talking before, Scott, about this and how, like allowing things to have an element of Darwinism and finding its own natural resting place. Because some things, you know, like you might do it, it might be a rapid prototype test in that top world, and nobody else might need it, right? So you might then just refine it and productionize it and stuff, but it might never move into another tier, and that's okay. I think that's cool.
And let's also test, like experiment cheaply, try out new technology, all that kind of great stuff, and then if it's good, it's going to make it through, rather than trying to be a bit ivory tower about it and say, go through some huge selection process about which search technology you're going to use. It's like, well, 5 of the teams have all picked different ones, and one because it was just better.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
probably faster and cheaper than that, than your more traditional, almost like, you know, request for tender process.
Tender, yeah.
It's 2 years to evaluate stuff, and even then you pick the wrong things. So I think that's cool. I might I'm conscious of time. Do you want to kind of finish off, just round out your thing, and then we get on to Q&A?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I was looking at the time too. So basically this is where it ended up. So we graduated, we had an element of product teams that were kind of more end-to-end with platform teams on it. And the main thing I wanted to talk about here was just the ratio between them. If you let everything graduate to the bottom and everything becomes platform teams, then you just go back to this world, right? So again, I want to kind of talk about the responsibility of making sure that we don't go either way too far on the spectrum. The only other things I basically had was to kind of ask yourself how dependent you are on other teams. And this is usually a quick one I do. I just kind of ask teams to grab the top 10 items in their backlog and basically work out which ones they can do independently and which ones they need team for. And that will give you a pretty good gut feel of a percentage of how dependent you are on other teams. If you're pretty autonomous, pardon?
How agile your architecture is, maybe.
Yeah, this is like my little test for it. And then probably ask yourself what your organization values as well, and which one, or maybe even go to your manager or your head of engineering or your CPO or something and ask them this question. This is always great to see what they think. And then the rest was pretty much just, you know, just summarizing, right? That, you know, agility needs the right foundation. Like you can't expect teams to be autonomous without, you know, providing them the foundation to do it. And that we need to structure our teams around our architecture around our teams and not the other way around. And basically start with this and start with optimizing for time to value and look at cost and, you know, reuse second. That's kind of your, you know, if you take anything away, think about that when it comes to implementing it. That's like your guiding principle.
Cool.
And yeah, that was some of the things I kind of talked through and basically monitor that ratio. And that was it.
Cool. Now, thanks for that. Any questions? Now's the time. Pop them in the chat box or the Q&A window. And there's one to kick off. We've already kind of dealt with one of them. Let's go to the other one, which is, I know I've got some myself as well, but moving away from a monolith in a mature system takes months, if not years. What do you think should happen in the meantime, Anne?
Yeah, so this is all like a pretty common problem space, right? Like some things would take ages to kind of, get off and all that. I think well, I don't think, because I know, because I've done this, right? So like the reality is you need to look at your architecture as a whole, and you need to work out what makes sense to start, where does it make sense to start, and where does it make sense to kind of like slowly chip away at. You're going to have like these big monolithical things that you're not going to change overnight, particularly those ones where, I told you that story about that thing that's, it actually was his 21st birthday and everybody was so scared about touching it. And that's like a big program of work. And somebody at the top needs to invest in that, because that's 21 years of tech debt, in my opinion, that's accumulated, and the bills come in. And you need to but that's something that's probably going to happen on the side. There's other things though where you can be a bit more evolutional. Probably the first thing to start looking at is anything new that you're building, and can you just kind of start with this mentality from the get-go. And then there's things where that wouldn't be too hard to break up because they're not such old technology. The web space is usually like quite a good space to start as well. Design language systems and stuff is a great place for this to play as well. Yeah, does that answer the question?
And hopefully, did that answer your question? If not, please pop something in the chat. And then I think my follow-up from that is like, how do you go about getting the budget to do an agile like, I know this sounds but how do you go about getting the budget? Like, you got a monolith or something and you're going, or you, I mean, greenfields is easy because you just start that way.
Yep.
But if you've got an existing org structure and a bunch of applications sitting there, what's the pitch? How do you get
Yeah, so like my pitch usually comes back to that kind of Mario slide we're trying to decide, and I tend to find it resonates with them to frame it that way, because you're not saying, hey, we need to kind of, you're not saying one's better or worse, right? You're just saying that they have pros and cons. Is number one. Number two is you're also kind of framing it in a way to say, hey, if we go down this path, do you know that it means that things will be duplicated, things will be inconsistent? And I often find some of the, like, I guess, gripe with it is that nobody was clear with them up front that was going to happen. And then suddenly they're looking at the bill from AWS, they're seeing these teams do these things. Yeah.
Anthony, just to you're talking about the slide or the trade-off between speed versus reuse and low cost. Is that the decision?
Yes. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, just to be clear, I guess. That slide, that is like, Mario trying to make that choice between those two pipes, and it's between consistency and reuse and kind of speed and autonomy. And what I tend to get them to do is kind of rank them, and if they rank that consistency and cost and stuff is more important, then the conversation probably ends there, and you're never going to get buy-in, right? Because that's just not what they value. But if it goes the other way, then you can start to talk about, well, let's talk about what that means and where do we start. And
and the next question is, what ratios of product versus platform have you seen?
Yeah, it's a very common one. I've seen a few ratios. Probably the most common ratio that it kind of sits at is between like a 3-to-2 ratio or a 1-to-4 ratio, if that makes sense. So in other words, no, 1-to-3. So in other words, either somewhere between every 3 to 4 product teams, you will have one platform team. That makes sense, right?
The golden ratio, is it?
I don't know if it's a golden ratio. I just it's an observation that I've had from doing this. But I will say, like, when I think about that ratio, I can see how 1-to-2, so like every 2 teams is one platform team, is pretty close to like 50-50, right? You're starting to get close to that. And if you went like the other way, I don't know, 6 teams to 1 or something, I could see how that maybe, but that could make sense for your context. I just haven't really seen it get that far out, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Maybe it is a magic ratio. I don't know.
Cool. And there's another question here from, that one was from Teresa. Teresa, if you've got, hopefully that answered your question. If not, please pop something in. We're just going to take, I think there's one more question here. I think we've probably got time for one or more others after that. I'll just grab this last question. How emergent should the architecture be? Should you not pick up architecture patterns already implemented? Well, I've just seen rhetorical questions, so we might leave that one. We've spoken about mines around budget, getting it up, getting the change. Yeah, I think if anyone's got any questions, pop them in the channel now. Otherwise, we'll just wait a few seconds, and then otherwise we're gonna sign off and say thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll just add why people, if anyone's going to write a question, definitely just hit me up with a question. I'll try, and LinkedIn or Twitter's usually the best. Just message me on that. I try and get back to everyone, and I'll try and answer your question. And I'll maybe as well, if there's no question, maybe I could answer that rhetorical one, because like applying architecture patterns makes sense, and it does, but also at the same time, doesn't make sense to copy a pattern that was in an organization that might be different to yours, right? And your contexts aren't always the same to begin with. And the other thing to begin with too is some of those architecture patterns are kind of from a more old school world of thought, as opposed to an agile kind of more speed autonomy kind of world of thought. That makes sense too. So I guess you gotta, but by all means, if there's a good one out there, for sure, don't reinvent the wheel. Yeah.
There's one last question, and we'll take it. It's slightly related to agile architecture, I think, which is how do you prioritize tech debt over new features? This is a bit of a topic that I definitely love, which is, so I was an engineer for years and then wasn't so much, but the tech debt is only a debt if you've got to pay it down, is my starting point. Otherwise, it's not a debt. And I often see and have lots of conversations with people like, oh, the code's not beautiful. The fact is it works. And this is the engineer and commercially minded person in me, which is, it's only a debt if you got to pay it back. So figure out first, like, are you ever going to have to pay the thing back? Because often there's occasions where you don't. All right, sure, it's a bit ugly and we had to do some hacks to make it work, but there's other things to do to make the organization succeed. So I think that's the first one for me. But then just on a purely practical level, the easiest way to prioritize it is to attach customer value to the debt. So what's the value of paying down this debt to your customer? I had a great example the other day of doing an infrastructure a complete rebuild to go to new infrastructure, and the entire justification, so you'd think of it as a tech debt problem, but intelligently the product manager leading it framed it in terms of lost revenue, because of instead of taking 3 seconds like a good app should, it was taking 10 to 15 to process to process steps in their payment flow. And when they put it in those terms, all of a sudden that tech debt payment of 500 grand or $1 million, whatever it was, to shift this, it was probably a bit higher, but to shift it, suddenly when it was put in the perspective of a few percentage points of revenue on $1 billion plus company like revenue line, you're starting to talk like peanuts to shift this thing over. And so I think that's the number one way to prioritize tech debt. On a more micro level, those kind of like debts that make the application easier to use. For me, I think teams should be allocated a bit of time each week or each month just to pay down what they think is good to pay down. That's I think hopefully that answers that. And I don't know if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is I worked with somebody who, I'm trying to remember who said it too. They said the thing with debt is it accumulates interest. And I thought that was brilliant, because tech debt does accumulate interest. Every time you don't do it and you add to it, you're basically adding to it, right? Every time you don't do it and touch the code base. The other thing that I tend to do is exactly that, right? But I particularly frame it with people as I say, frame it as the cost of not doing it, right? Because it's hard to justify the cost of like doing it, right? And the cost of not doing it is usually higher, because if we don't do it, for example, in that example was perfect, right? If we don't do it, well, then there's revenue lost. So yeah, I think that's, I've very much the same approach to you, Scott. Frame it that way. Yeah.
Cool. Well, look, thank you everyone for being on the call. I hope you all have a good day, and thank you so much for sharing this with everyone. I think hopefully everyone got something out of it. I certainly did. And see you next time, everyone. See you on the next one. Bye.
Yeah, thanks.